For decades, countries believed security could be purchased. Buy advanced fighter jets, host foreign military bases, sign defense contracts worth billions. And in return, powerful allies would guarantee stability. That was the logic behind much of the post-Cold War order. But from Ukraine to Gaza, from the Gulf to the Black Sea, that assumption is now being tested. Because the defining question of modern conflict is no longer simply who spends the most. It is who can endure the longest. I'm Afzal Ahmed and this is Aloud. This show brings you articles made for audio. In this episode, we've adapted the piece, Lessons from the New World Order. Security cannot be bought, it must be built, by Onur Doğan, published on TRT World on May the 6th, 2026. The wars shaping this decade have exposed something deeper than battlefield victories and defeats. They have exposed the limits of what money alone can buy. For years, Gulf states operated under a relatively straightforward formula. The United States would provide military protection. In exchange, Gulf governments would purchase weapon systems, host American bases, and maintain strategic alignment with Washington. The arrangement appeared stable. But recent conflicts have forced governments across the region to reconsider whether external protection can ever fully guarantee long-term security. Iran's growing missile and drone capabilities changed the equation. American military installations themselves became potential targets. And suddenly, the presence designed to provide safety also became part of the threat landscape. The old security model began to look far less certain. Russia's war with Ukraine accelerated this shift. When Moscow launched its full-scale war in February 2022, many expected the conflict to end quickly. Instead, the war stretched on for years. And despite Russia's enormous military spending, the second largest defense budget globally, Ukraine survived, not because Ukraine had more money, but because it had something else, a sustainable support structure. The reason was simple. On the other side stood not just Ukraine, but a web of Western partners providing weapons, intelligence, financing, and sanctions pressure in a coordinated, sustained manner. The war demonstrated a critical lesson for military planners around the world. A state backed by resilient alliances and adaptable production systems can outlast an opponent with larger raw military capacity. The decisive factor was not simply firepower, it was sustainability. Then there is Gaza. If Ukraine demonstrated the value of sustainable defense, Gaza demonstrated something else entirely. The long-term costs of a military onslaught without strategic accountability. Israel entered the genocidal war on Gaza with overwhelming military superiority. It had advanced weapon systems, diplomatic backing from the United States, and broad Western support immediately after October 2023. But months and months later, the political landscape surrounding the conflict looked dramatically different. Israel expanded its occupation across large parts of Gaza and said it had destroyed infrastructure it claimed was linked to Hamas. Yet globally, support began to fracture. Countries like Ireland, Spain, and Norway moved towards stronger diplomatic and legal criticism. Even within countries that have maintained closer ties to Israel, the UK, Germany, and Italy, official voices have increasingly broken ranks, calling for ceasefires, arms embargoes, and humanitarian access. The International Court of Justice became increasingly involved. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants targeting Israeli leadership. Meanwhile, protests spread across university campuses from London to Los Angeles. even as some governments have moved to restrict or criminalize such expression. And across much of the global south, Israel's international standing deteriorated sharply. The central point here is not whether military objectives were achieved, it is that military power alone no longer determines strategic success. Modern conflicts unfold under constant global scrutiny. Public opinion, economic relationships, international law, digital media, corporate pressure, alliance cohesion. All of these now shape the battlefield. A state may win territory while simultaneously losing legitimacy. And once legitimacy erodes, rebuilding long-term security becomes far more difficult. Israel may occupy more territory than it did in October 2023, but it inhabits a fundamentally different world, one in which its strategic isolation has deepened with every passing month. The humanitarian catastrophe has become paradoxically Israel's most consequential strategic liability, one no Iron Dome system can intercept. This is why the definition of security itself is changing. In the past, the old formula was simple. Money buys military capacity produces security. The Gulf states spent decades testing that formula, and the results were instructive. Saudi Arabia paid hundreds of millions to host American forces on its own soil, forces that were meant to deter external threats that became a source of political tension and eventually a target themselves. The security package purchased did not include what was on the invoice. Today, resilience matters just as much. Can a country continue producing under sanctions? Can it secure food and energy supplies during geopolitical crises? Can it develop technologies that are not dependent on foreign approval? Can society remain stable under prolonged pressure? These questions increasingly define strategic power. Drone systems, cybersecurity, communications infrastructure, supply chains, energy independence, industrial manufacturing. These are no longer secondary issues, they are central pillars of national security. And unlike imported weapon systems, they cannot simply be purchased overnight. They require years of policy planning, investment, domestic production, and political coordination.
Mesdames et messieurs, votre attention s'il vous plaît. Ceci est le tout dernier appel avant la fermeture des ports. British Airways departure to Mumbai, flight number 149. Final call to all passengers. Achtung bitte, dies ist der letzte Aufruf für den Lufthansa-Flug LH710 nach Tokio. Alle Passagiere werden gebeten, sich umgehend zu Flugsteig A39 zu begeben.
At the same time, countries are also rethinking alliances. The unipolar era simplified global politics. Many states aligned closely with one dominant power bloc. But today's world is more fragmented. And governments increasingly recognize that no single alliance can solve every strategic challenge. Economic partnerships may come from one direction, military cooperation from another, technological development from somewhere else entirely, and climate and food security elsewhere. This is especially visible in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar have all expanded relations with China and Russia while still maintaining security ties with Washington. The Saudi-Pakistan relationship also reflects this broader shift. Pakistan contributes strategic deterrence. Saudi Arabia provides financial support and investment. These partnerships do not fit neatly into traditional Cold War-style alliance categories because states are no longer choosing fixed camps, they are choosing functions, different partnerships for different needs. And perhaps no country illustrates this emerging approach more clearly than Turkey. Turkey holds a uniquely flexible position in global politics. It remains a NATO member while maintaining complex ties with Russia. It continues formal EU accession talks while engaging in BRICS-related discussions. It participates in Western security structures while also attending Shanghai Cooperation Organization meetings. To some observers, these overlapping relationships appear contradictory, but Ankara sees them differently as strategic flexibility. Turkey has spent years positioning itself as a state that multiple power centers cannot ignore. Its role in brokering the Black Sea Green Deal between Russia and Ukraine demonstrated this clearly. Neither Washington nor Brussels could fully replicate Turkey's ability to communicate with both sides. That diplomatic access was built over decades. The same pattern appears in Syria, in the Caucasus, in negotiations involving Hamas and Israel. Turkey's influence increasingly comes from its ability to engage simultaneously across rival political spheres. Rather than attaching itself entirely to one geopolitical bloc, Ankara has attempted to become indispensable to several. Turkey is perhaps the clearest example that a middle power on its way to becoming a superpower can not only survive this transition, but also shape it. This may be one of the defining features of the emerging world order. The countries likely to succeed are not necessarily the wealthiest, nor the ones with the largest ministries, but the ones capable of balancing resilience, adaptability, and strategic relationships. The Gulf states are already redesigning their security calculations around this reality. Ukraine's survival has reinforced it, and Israel's war on Gaza has demonstrated the consequences of ignoring the political and humanitarian dimensions of modern conflict. The age of simple dependency is fading. Security can no longer be treated like a subscription service purchased from a distant superpower. Because alliances shift, supply chains break, wars drag on, public opinion changes, and global legitimacy matters more than more governments once believed. The strongest states are not simply those with advanced weapons. They are the ones capable of building systems that survive disruption. These are now the foundations of sustainable security. That's all for this episode of Aloud, based on the piece Lessons from the New World Order. Security cannot be bought, it must be built, by Onur Doğan, published on TRT World on May the 6th, 2026. I'm your host Afzal Ahmed. Thanks for listening.